Let's make a start then. Well, firstly, welcome. Thank you for having me again to talk about rough guides to doing a dissertation. And in particular, I'm probably going to do this in a number of ways. The first is that the idea of this presentation, if you like, or at least discussion, I'd like it really, there's only 6 slides. So really, I want to really address really 3 central things, which is basically what a dissertation is, why do it, and how to do it. And really, I'm going to do, as I did before with other things, a kind of rough guide in terms. There's lots and lots of books and support on the library support about how to do a dissertation, but I think what we really need to do for master's students in particular is a kind of rough guide. In particular, how can we shortcut to the most important things that we need to think about. So I'm going to deal with the 3 central questions of what it is, why do it, and how to think about starting one. So that's really what I'm going to look at, and I'm going to really just say that I'm not just doing this because I've supervised quite a lot of these, but I've also been an external examiner on a lot of them as well. And if you can get the concept and idea right at the start, it makes things a lot easier. You're not fighting with yourself about what a dissertation is about. So really, this session really is to introduce people to what is a dissertation, really, and for them to think about whether they want to do it. I mean, my suggestion is always that it's great being a postgraduate, but ultimately, if you don't do a dissertation, then effectively you will never have a master's level qualification. And it would seem a tragedy with such qualified people as yourselves that you don't go the extra mile. But I'd put that on record because I think you're all capable of doing some exciting stuff. So let's move on a little bit in the way that we can push this forward. So what is a dissertation then? Well, you can, if you get on the internet or do or look for the university, you'll find lots of definitions of what a dissertation is, and in many ways, does it differ from a thesis? But I always use this very simple definition myself, and it's something which is basically, for me, a dissertation is a substantial paper on a subject chosen by the candidate that is typically based on research and that provides evidence of a candidate's engagement with and mastery of both a key subject and of scholarly method. Now, what does that mean in English? Well, what it means in effectively, a dissertation is worth 60 credits of your master's degree, so it's worth a third of it, and it's the area where you can shine. So ultimately, it's a research project which the candidate chooses. So fundamentally, it's the one part of the degree where you have, in many ways, ultimate control about the subject matter. It's also the place where you typically, of course, it's a research project, and of course, it's basically a university, so it has to have quite a high level of scholarship in it. In other words, it's where you can demonstrate your mastery of research methods and scholarship. But it also, in my view, is the piece of work that you will show to employers and that you show to other parties, which will have the key dissemination. And I've as you know, directed quite a few master's degrees in the past at 4 different institutions, and I have to say that the dissertation is in many ways the thing that employers, policymakers remember most about people. So I think that's critically important for you to think about. But in addition, of course, and it's very important for us that disaster management, for me, is not just a research study topic. It's also an applied area. So in addition, it's hoped that dissertation will have relevance for professional practice on policy, and therefore has implications, sorry Richard, the famous phrase, for researching for professional practice. So in that sense, that's what it's about, really. It's a research project. It's worth 60 credits, but it's also an area where people have the ability to really shape what they want to do and also maybe have a policy impact for the future. So let me move on to, well, why do it then? Well, I've sort of intimated this a little bit in what I've just outlined. But I think what I'm trying to say, if I go back to a dissertation, as a dissertation is in many ways not just an extended essay, right? And I think the important thing to recognise, what's the difference between a dissertation and an essay? Well, of course, an essay, really you're doing a topic which has been defined for you. So usually the question's been defined for you, the subject area is closely monitored, and really you're guided very strongly to do subject area, the area. And an extended essay is really doing more of the same. But a dissertation gives you choice, and it gives the ability to do something that you want to do. So I think that's fundamentally important. And therefore it shows your discretion, your initiative, and also your ability to contribute to future agendas in Oman. So why do a dissertation? Well, for me, I think there's always four things that a dissertation offers as part of a master's degree. Not just the obvious point, of course, is that it's the key component of a master's degree. So if you think about it, a master's degree is 180 credits long. First semester courses, or the first part of the courses that would lead to a postgraduate certificate, is 60 credits, 3 courses. Another 3 courses leads you to a postgraduate diploma. Then that gives you a postgraduate qualification, of which you've done master's levels courses. But really, the master's dissertation is really the university in kind of industrial standard, if you like, of what makes a taught master's degree, and what turns really a postgraduate study into a full master's level qualification and study, in my view. So, and of course, because it represents 1/3 of a master's degree, and that's quite important to recognise, because of course it can have a major influence on your overall profile. And usually, by the time people have done 6 courses, and they're also working in the area of disaster management, they've got a high degree of capacity and expertise of their own. So this is, in many ways, what we often find is that dissertation is an area where you get what's called exit velocity, as it's called, where people do better or do well because they're able to use all of the stuff they used in the courses and apply it to their own area and really specialise in a particular subject. So, in a sense, what I'm arguing here is that it's not just important as a key component, it's also an ability to really influence, and really usually pushes people up rather than down in terms of their overall marks. Most students think it's the opposite, in truth, but my experience is that it leads to, if you like, more trajectory upwards rather than downwards, because people can apply what they really know and what they are strong at. The second point is it shows research credentials. And I think the important thing really is it shows expertise. It shows expertise in handling a particular area of scholarship. And it also really shows an expertise about being able to drill down into certain types of research methods, be it what's called qualitative research methods, which might be interviews or rather deep archival research, or quantitative methods, which is questionnaires, surveys, and data analysis. So it allows people to play to their strengths. So for people, for example, who are doing cybersecurity, where their background may be very much in the quantitative area, they can really shine in that area. For those people that are more interested in policy and want to do more detailed, high-level interviews, it allows them to shine in that area as well. And that's really what makes the difference. In an essay, you never really get to grips. You never have enough space, in truth, to be able to show your expertise in scholarship and research methods to the full shop window. The third element, I'd say, is to use a university term, and I hate using this term, to put it bluntly, to demonstrate employability. In other words, what I mean by that, it's the place where the individual truly shines. In other words, what it shows, as I said to you before, your dissertation is often the area where, if you're in an interview or you're in a policy discussion, it's actually you actually make reference to your dissertation, often at master's level or a PhD level, your thesis, about actually where the impact may be. And you can't necessarily always do that when you've said that you've written an essay in a course, but you can say, if you've done a research dissertation on this area, that you have a major contribution to be made. And you'll often find, of course, in the policy domain, particularly in certain parts of the world, then research dissertations can have quite an important impact on policy if they're written and applied. So, if you like, it allows them you'll demonstrate expertise in having a value added to your area. And that, as I say, is a personal level, it can be quite important for your own personal career development. Because I've made this point, and I'll make this point strongly to both Richard and Lauren, that in many ways there's a kind of gap in the skills base at the moment. There are lots of people who are moving forward to have postgraduate qualifications in master's levels in disaster management. But that's only a recent phenomenon, really. It hasn't happened to a large extent for a long time. So actually what we're doing is that these dissertations have real career development opportunities to them. And the final aspect is policy relevance. We're all here doing this course, and we're all involved in our exciting discussions for Oman. And you probably heard me say enough times that I'm not just here because, well, I like you guys, and more importantly, I think it's important that we educate students in master's level work, but also we're all here because we want policy relevance for Oman. We want to make sure that the kind of things that we're doing in our master's courses can have policy relevance or professional practice implications back home in Oman. And really, the dissertation is probably the most key area where you can really apply that and have a negotiation with your own ministry, with your own organisation, about what kind of project that should be. So really, it's where the applied side for me comes out really quite strongly. So it's a key component of a master's. It's a way of showing that you're a researcher. It's a way of progressing with your own career development. And more importantly, it has major policy relevance and implications if it's designed the right way. It's part of a dialogue, a conversation with Oman and with your own respective institutions. So saying that, that's the what and the why. What I now want to do in my in the last five minutes or so is to talk about, well, okay, I'm sold now. I'm going to do this dissertation. What does it mean then? What does it actually mean? What have I got to do? And broadly, a dissertation, to start at the bottom of the slide, is, as you know, a subject specialist research project chosen, but it's basically 15,000 words long, which sounds a lot of words. But if we work on the assumption that one side of A4 text has approximately about 500 words on it, then we're talking about 30 pages of text and figures and annexes and bibliographies. So it's not, although people think the dissertation is a very large piece of work, it's better to think about it as being a very focused piece of work where you have a little bit more words to deal with it. So in practice, it's quite important to recognize that a dissertation has to be quite strongly focused in what we're doing. So it's bigger than an essay, it's bigger than an extended essay, but you're not writing a thesis of 100,000 words, and you're not running a multi-million-pound research project. It had to be a rather practical, focused piece of work. So that's what it is. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But broadly, as a rough guide, any dissertation usually has up to 6 parts. And I really want to just spend 5 minutes talking about what those parts are. Now, for those people that have done dissertations before at undergraduate level, or more accurately may have done it at postgraduate level elsewhere, doing other subjects, then this is quite strongly a social science focus to it. So I would say that firstly. But broadly, we're talking about the same thing, even if it was a natural science, if we were doing a kind of hard study of hazards or whatever it might be. The most important parts of any dissertation are actually the introduction and the conclusion. And part 1 is the introduction. So the introduction usually defines basically what the research problem is, what the problem is that you're going to look at, the aim of the dissertation, the objectives of the dissertation, and usually the research questions. So it really says, you know, why am I doing this? So, or let's put it this way, what's the problem? Why are we doing this? And how am I going to do it? That's basically what the introduction does. And it's much the same way as we would think about the first part of any essay. But really, because you are defining the subject yourself, i.e. the subject matter, it might be that you're, for example, looking at a cyclone, or you might be looking at early warning systems, or you might be looking at risk analysis. Then the introduction is key because it defines how wide or how small the subject is. It's like a piece of elastic, if you know what I mean, a piece of stretchy material. You can make it as wide or as narrow as you want it to be. But the key is that the introduction provides the, if you like, the framework in which any examiner will be marking. So you can actually be very specific, and then an examiner only really marks within that subject that you're talking about. So introduction is key. And what you set out in your introduction, you should return to in your conclusion, i.e. treat it like a circle, i.e. in your conclusion, you should really address, you know, have you done this the right way? What are your general conclusions are? And more importantly, what your future research or practical implication recommendations may be. In other words, the conclusion goes back to what you say you're going to do in the introduction. But broadly within that, if we go past the introduction, then usually there's a number of static components of any dissertation. The second part is the literary review. And the literary review is a kind of, let's say, review of the landscape of the existing literature. It might be academic literature, it might be primary documents, like reports, or it could actually be secondary material, journal reports, journalistic articles. But fundamentally, what this does is it lays out the landscape. Now, one thing that students often get a little bit confused about with literary review is they think they've got to include everything about a subject area in a literary review. In truth, you don't have the words, and secondly, you don't need to. And what I mean by that is that a literary review in a dissertation basically is about really looking at the literature that's relevant to your subject area, to your thesis. So it usually does three things. It usually says what's said out there that's important. It usually also says where other people have said the gaps in the literature that need to be filled. And it usually includes literature which you either disagree with or contest. In other words, you say people are wrong and therefore you need to address. So really, that's all it does. So we're not talking about something that sets out the entire world or tries to change the world. It's something that's really quite focused and is really about looking at the literature that's purely relevant to your thesis. In other words, you always keep your glasses, your goggles on, if you like, which are basically the dissertation is doing this, and I'm only interested in this literature, which is something that is of relevance to what I'm doing. That's it. Now, the next part of a dissertation then is, okay, if you've outlined the landscape, then basically you need to decide, well, what you're going to do with it. And usually, part 3 or part 4 of a dissertation, you can either have a conceptual framework and then a methodology, or you can have a methodology and then a conceptual framework. The 3 and 4 bits are either together, one way or another way, but usually they're related. And the conceptual framework is basically what you're going to do. What kind of concept, what kind of theory, what kind of idea are you introducing? Now, because it's a dissertation at master's level, and I can't stress this enough, what this means is in practice is you're not trying to change the world. Effectively, you're usually doing a master's dissertation, usually just one of 3 things. It usually takes existing literature and applies it to an area which may or may not have been covered before. So you might think of a theory, complexity theory, foresight theory, concepts of early warning, and then apply it to Oman because it's never been done in Oman, or there's never been a case study of Oman. So you're taking what is traditionally there and apply it in a new area. Second idea is you can have a conceptual thesis. So you're going to add a little bit extra and say basically, well, these concepts are good, but they don't really deal with this particular aspect. So I'm going to add this particular concept. There's a real problem with this concept because it doesn't do this. We need to think about that. So you're adding to the concept. Or you're doing a mixture of both in practice, where you may actually be applying it to a new area, but actually what you're also doing is doing a kind of review about where the literature might want to go in the future. So your conceptual framework is effectively what you're going to add. And your part 4 then, if that's the concept, part 3, part 4 is the methodology. And that's usually, if part 1 is, if you know why I'm going to do this, part 2, the literary review, is what's out there. Part 3 is basically what I'm going to do. Then part 4, the methodology, is how am I going to do it, you know, and that means usually a choice of what kind of research method you're going to use, whether you're going to use a quantitative approach, questionnaires, surveys with data analysis, or you're going to use what's called a qualitative approach, where of course you're probably going to be involved in detailed, deep interviews. And just as a rough guide, I would say one needs to keep in mind the practicality of time here and about how much time you're going to have to do this. And broadly, what you tend to find is unless you have access to large amounts of data, then quantitative dissertations are more difficult to do in the time period that you have to do it. So qualitative ones are usually a good way forward because they're more manageable in terms of the way that you can do. You can interview people in Oman, and you can get interviews quickly than compared to acquiring a lot of data. And often you need big data sets to do something quite practical in terms of quantitative sets. Okay, but I'm not against it. It's not part of it. It's just a piece of advice. Qualitative ones are more practically able to be done at master's level. And once you've done that, then basically part 5, if you're doing a conceptual one, then you're empirical. may be talking about looking at a particular ministry, an organisation. They may be looking at
Professor, we lost last minute.
or an hazard.
Okay.
Yep. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So. Okay, splendid. And so the empirical findings or the field work is actually the case study or the area or the thematic. In other words, what you're going to apply it to. And that would be if you're doing a qualitative one where you would present the findings from the interviews. And in other areas, you might also want to say it would be where you would present your data findings. And then part 6 is the conclusion, where you basically say from all these findings, do you answer your research questions, which you've set out in your introduction and your conceptual framework. So broadly, that's what it's about. Now, the question people always ask is, how many words then do I put to each section? And it's really up to you, because it depends on the kind of thesis that you're doing. But if you've got 15,000 words, your introduction might only be 1,000 words long, and your conclusion might only be 1,000 words long, because you're using 2,000 there, and then you're splitting your other 13,000 words across the other 5 areas. So some people will do big findings chapters because they've got a lot to say, and will have shorter methodology sections. Some will be dealing with an area where there isn't much literature out there, so the literature review will be smaller. Other areas are contributing to an area, say on natural hazards, where there's loads of stuff where they need to do. So the way to think about this is that these are the areas that you need to address when you're doing a dissertation. And of course, as part of the one-to-ones, when we're developing these, that's the way it will work forward. So basically, how to do a dissertation then. I want to end with my one final slide, if I may. And that's basically how to do it. And really, this is the rough guide bit. As you probably know, when I do these kind of things, really I want to leave with you is some experience about what are the kind of things you need to think about. It's fine to say there's these 6 parts, but how do we get off at first base then? And for me, as you can see there, there's basically seven, if you like, guidance points that I'd like to make to you. The first is that if you're doing a dissertation, you need a clear focus. Be very clear about what you're going to do. And what I mean by that is often people think dissertations are about dealing with a big area because they think 15,000 words is a lot of words. And they then think they think of these big issues and then they try to challenge them all. And if you've only got, say, 2,000 words in a conceptual chapter, or your empirical findings are only presented in 3,000 words, you can't save the world. You can't deal with this kind of thing. And the best way to think about this is think narrow. Think about a small area. So if you're going to look at, for example, response in Oman, then look at, for example, a particular element of it, mass casualties. Think about tracking. Think about risk. For example, pick one area that is of importance. Okay, and the reason why I say that is because often if the subject's too wide, it becomes very difficult to narrow it down. But if it's the other way around, if the subject's too narrow, you can always tweak it, move it, expand it to include new areas, and you'll still have a cracking dissertation. So think narrow. What's the focus of this? Okay. The second is, okay, I'm going to concentrate on this area, say early warning systems in Oman. What's the angle that you're going to take? In other words, what's the hook? Have you found a good article or a good report that says there's a particular challenge, say disaster risk reduction, or there's a problem with certain types of communication systems or health planning, and you're going therefore to take an angle? Because this work says this, we're going to examine this because this is a key challenge. To understand how we dealing with mass casualties in health planning, we need effectively also understand how we're going to reduce risk in relation to health planning, for example. So an angle, what's the focus and what's the hook? How are you coming into the subject? So find an angle, clear focus, find an angle. My third point is be clear on the methodology. And that is effectively decide which type of approach you're going to take and more or less stick to it if you can. So, and I would suggest at master's level that qualitative approaches are usually more manageable. So if you're going to focus, then how are you going to do this? And usually what we're talking about with a master's dissertation is that if you can include primary interviews and reference to primary documentation, it will immediately take your dissertation to a higher level. And you have access to some outstanding people in Oman, and therefore, my experience is that people who interview people in Oman get a lot of material from them that they can use and reflect upon. So be clear on the methodology. And the fourth point is probably the most important. Be realistic and practical. Can it be done just by you and in a reasonable time? So effectively, that's why we think narrow of an area, because you also want to make sure you complete this dissertation. And broadly, you should be completing it as a ballpark part-time within 6 months, I would say. 6 months would be a ballpark figure that I would say is a good thing to do. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is the practical reality of what can you do and how can you do it. You don't have access maybe to a large amount of resources. You don't necessarily have access to hundreds of people that you need to interview. And broadly, if you can interview 10 major policymakers in a particular narrow focused area, then that puts you in very good stead, for example, when we talk about dissertation. So be realistic and practical about what you can do. Think about the time, think about the space, if you hear me say. And also, I think the important thing is think about the ethics and the clearance. And of course, because we're all working at a very high level, in Oman, if you're going to do your dissertation, which is related to Oman or elsewhere, what kind of clearance do you have access, or do you need access to particular types of plans, documents, and can you get them? You can't. Now, let me be clear: 90% of dissertation should be done without, even having access to some of the key documents. But there are some ones that you really do need, and it may shape where we go with the dissertation. So, what permissions might you need within your own organisation? In relation to that. And that's a discussion, of course, that we need to take now in relation to that. And we'll try to help you as much as we can. I'm sure David and the team will also as well. And finally, to think about the structure. How are you going to divide the chapters, in terms of those parts and its relevance? What do you want the dissertation to do for you afterwards? And probably that's the most important thing. It's not just about realistic and practical about what you're doing when you do the dissertation, but for me, it's also about thinking what you want to do with it, what this dissertation might be useful for you and also for your organisation in the future. So think about it in that way. Focus, angle, methodology, realism, clearance, structure, and relevance. So most of these points are absolutely obvious to most people, but I can't tell you how. If you think about those now, then those are the key to the way to doing a really, really dissertation, which has real advantage. So the way to think about this, I often say, is to get one side of A4 piece of paper and think of a very short title, write a 300-word abstract about what the research challenge is, put a list of bulletin point structure of the individual chapters. So introduction might be talking about this, chapter 1 we'll be talking about that, chapter 2 we'll be talking about this type of methodology, and write a list of 10 publications that will be key to your dissertation. That gives you a way of understanding what's out there. So a title, an abstract, a structure, and a bibliography. And what often my students do is that they will produce more than one, because it gets them to think about, okay, I'm going to do early warnings in Oman. I like that, but I don't think that's going to work too well. What we really need to do is think about technology of early warning systems, and I need to do that. So moving forward, this is a kind of rough guide way, a title, an abstract, a bulletin point structure, and a bibliography on one side of A4 that gives you the way of thinking about all of those points that I mentioned here. When you do that, when you write the title and you think the abstract, you're focusing on the focus and the angle. When you do the structure, you're thinking about the methodology, the practice, the clearance, and the structure. And the bibliography also illustrates its relevance. So by doing that, you deal with all of the things I've just talked about. So to bring this to a close, the way forward, when you think about dissertation, I think you probably need to think about these areas. Firstly, start with the focus and the angle. Then think about, why is this important to do? And more importantly, what's the angle that you're going to come into this? What somebody said, what report has come out of a particular think tank or a particular government report that says there's an area that needs to be addressed. In your own organisation, has there been meetings or documents which have identified that we need to think about this for the future? Think about the methodology. How are you going to do it? Think about how realistic and practical it is in terms of time, and also whether you need clearance to do it, both in terms of ethics inside the university, but more importantly, I think in terms of policy clearance if you're going to talk about particular documents. And then you can think alongside that, using the way I've talked about before here, you can actually then think about the structure and the relevance. And if you follow that idea, it's a very simple idea about those rough guide of those 7 things, then you end up usually with a very clear idea of a dissertation. It sounds like a lot, but in practice, it's very, very simple stuff. But if you think about it now, and the discussions that we have now in the forthcoming months, it makes things a lot easier when you get really started on the dissertation. So I hope that's been useful. That's all I've got to say. I'd probably like to open it out to any questions or anything anybody has to say or offer. You can either say, ask it me now while we're together, or of course speak to Richard outside of the discussion. But maybe I should just ask Richard if he's still with us. Basically, is there anything else you would add that you think I've missed or would be important to include in this discussion? What do you think, Richard? Anything else?
No, I think that was really comprehensive. I think what we'll probably need to do is a number of additional short sessions like this. One on writing a literature review, just so that we can cover some simple points to guide people on that. Probably we need to cover quantitative and qualitative methodologies. I know that there are some training materials on that, on the BU website, and we can guide people to that. So what I think I'm going to suggest is that we will do a mixture of sending out materials which people can begin to look at, but then ask you, Lee, to run a session on quantitative and qualitative. We actually have done videos on quantitative and qualitative, teaching on that as part of the study skills package on the E3 learning. So people can go back to that. And then I think we do need to address the ethics issue as well, so that when people are preparing their questionnaires for their discussions and their interviews, those are properly cleared by us before they go out. So I think you've covered all the key issues, Lee. Thank you so much. But I know that we'll need to do some additional short, similar systems like this, just to cover those key components in a little bit more detail, backed up, as I say, by the study skills materials we've already put onto the E3 learning.
Yeah. The whole point of this session for me is really just to give people an idea of what a dissertation is about. Yeah. Let me be clear: you're not supposed to have all the answers by next week. The whole point of just using this session is people just to think about what the dissertation stage is about, and more importantly, what it offers people. I think that's important, and also, if you like, dealing with the fear of the unknown, if you like, because a lot of people who haven't done dissertations for a long time or have not done this kind of work before, then a kind of realism as to what it is. But I can't stress enough that a 15,000 word project sounds like a massive piece of work, but actually in practice, it's not that large. It's really about the focus, about being very strategic about what you want to do. And I think the advantage of what we have here with this master's course, and in particular with the group that we've got now, is that you are professional practice orientated people who are in the workplace, who everything you do has strategic value. So it gives you a chance to really, well, what kind of things would have real strategic value for the future, both for your organization and also for you as an individual. So that's, for me, at the heart of what we're doing, so that when they come out with a dissertation, I hope that all of you guys will not just have a qualification calling you a master's, but also in addition to that, you'll also have a lot of value added which you can use for the future. We're building capacity back in Oman, and dissertations at master's level are certainly one way of building that capacity.
Thank you. So should we open up, if there are any questions from anybody else who'd like to ask something now?
I think, Richard, building up on your point, and I know, Lee, obviously this is an introduction, but certainly if I just reflect on my last paper, when I went through this sort of turn it in piece, and before I understood filtering out, and I hit 30%, I think given the scale of the work that people are going to be doing, and some of the more complexities around referencing, where they might be referencing perhaps aspects of someone's interview, whether that's handwritten, a questionnaire, or maybe recorded, or their own personal reflections on observing some behaviour. I think, again, perhaps a more concise session on that would go a long way to helping some of us.
Yeah, that's not a problem. That's not a problem at all. I mean, usually these things tend to fall into place, but I think that would be very useful to do. I think, as you probably found out yourself, Dave, we turn it in. When you turn it in, it tends to usually be slightly higher, and then you have to recognise that there's usually with bibliographies and so forth that does tend to slightly distort that. But to put it bluntly, we're all used to looking at Turnitin in terms of it won't affect your marks or anything in that way in terms of a dissertation, because basically we're all sort of trained or all aware of what the strengths and weaknesses of Turnitin are. I mean, broadly, what you would say anyway is that most dissertations, particularly I think from this group who will do things, will actually be doing stuff where there hasn't been that much literature done, say on Oman or in the Middle East or whatever it might be. So in a sense, they'll already be playing to that strength in that particular area as well. But I'm quite happy to put a session together on that. There's not a problem.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Good. Lee, thank you very much indeed. This has been recorded by Lauren, so we will upload this onto Brightspace shortly. You can, and for those of you who want to hear it again, you better hear it again. We'll let you know in due course when we can run the additional seminars on this to cover some of those other areas. But I think just to finish on Lee's last penultimate slide, Lee, if you just go back one slide.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah.
Because it.
Oh, let's see. Oh, I do apologise. Hang on, let me get back in. Yeah.
I was just thinking a good way to finish is just go back one. Is to do this right now. Start thinking about the title that you want for your dissertation, and remembering what Lee said. Do you know of a particular question that a document has raised and said, look, as a result of this exercise, as a result of this operation, as a result of this response, we need more work in this area? So it may be that you already know an area that needs some work on. If so, there's your title. Start to write that 300-word abstract, which examines what is the problem and what you want to begin to do about it. You can put together your structure of indicative chapters and start looking at the publications for your bibliography. But the abstract and the title, I think we probably will ask you to, we'll come up with a date by which time you can begin to submit that, so that we can begin to help you with how you might approach that problem. And indeed, it may even be that Dave White and Saud might even be able to give assistance from their office if you needed it, in terms of reaching out to certain agencies or organizations, if you needed that. And certainly Henry and Lee would be able to give you assistance in the sort of the questionnaires, the ethics, and the areas that you want to begin to explore. But at this stage, start thinking about titles and abstracts.
Yeah, I think the important thing I'm saying here, Richard, and I think we'll all agree, is that why I use this technique is it's a way of starting a conversation. It's not an assessment piece. You're not being marked on it. It's just to start a bit of a focused conversation. And actually, what I tend to find is that master's students who are starting out doing their dissertation might produce one or more than one, and might produce 3 or 4, and they might be very close to each other. And then which just gives us a way of saying, well, actually, together, I think that works really well, but maybe we need to think about, have you thought about this particular area, or have you thought about this particular concept? And by doing that, that allows us to steer the conversation. So it's a kind of quality, revisiting quality, but it also allows us to make sure it's manageable. And that's what we want it to be. I don't want any of you guys wasting any of your time, your valuable time, going down a dissertation that might be too big, or might be too challenging, or more importantly, might not be realistic, or might not actually have the kind of impact that you would want it to have outside. So treat this as a development tool. It's a conversation, and that's why I always suggest starting it now, because actually later on, when you actually get down to really moving on the dissertation, you'll end up doing this anyway. You'll end up having to do this anyway. But you might as well use this as a very practical way of just dealing, if I may, with these particular, about the focus, the angle, how realistic, the clearance, the structure, and the relevance. Just gives us a very simple way of moving things forward. So that's usually a good tool to start things off in terms of the process. Okay.
Brilliant. Lee, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Lauren, for recording it. We'll end the session now. And just a last chance, any last final questions before we close?
Well, can I just say thank you to you all for joining me this morning, and more importantly, I think I'm quite excited for the people here. I think you can do some really good stuff, and I think dissertation is where we all learn something. The supervisors learn some new stuff as well. So it's probably a process which people always find rewarding. The value added is really quite strong. So I'm looking forward for those people who want to do dissertations to working with them on whatever level they want them to. Okay.
Please pick up someone who's.
Thanks, Lee. Okay, we'll close the meeting here. Many thanks again.